In this lesson, we will discuss what is autoloading and why use it. Autoloading is a facility built into the PHP language where if you try to use a class which has not yet been included or required, in other words, it is not yet available to PHP, PHP will launch a simple process known as autoloading. In the example you can see on the screen, if we say $A equals new custom class, if the file which defines custom class has not yet been included or required, PHP will automatically defer to the currently registered autoloading process in order to try to locate and include the file which represents this class. The reason why you would want to use autoloading is that this will avoid the necessity of having multiple include or require statements scattered throughout your code. It's very simple to set up autoloading. There are two primary techniques. The simplest is to define a function _autoload. The _autoload function is a magic function built into PHP which accepts a class name as an argument. The class name is supplied automatically at the time that PHP is looking for the definition of the class and is unable to find it. The _autoload function should be defined in what is referred to as the global namespace. So in other words, if you are using namespaces, make sure that you define this function outside of any specific namespaces. However, what is used more frequently is the capability built into the SPL or standard PHP library. There's a function called SPL Autoload Register, which allows you to register a function or a method within a class as the preferred autoloader. The additional advantage of using SPL Autoload Register is that you can register more than one autoloader. The first autoloader will be used before the second one, and you can continue to have a chain of autoloaders, the last one being the default fallback. It's also worth noting that if you are using Composer, Composer includes its own autoloader. Let's take a simple example. We've got a folder installation, a subfolder X with a file test.php, another folder Y with a file test.php. They both do essentially the same thing, but the key is that the class test under X will return X\test as an argument. They both do the same thing. They have the same class name. The difference is that one class is under the namespace X, the other class is under the namespace Y. And of course, when getTest is invoked, this will return X\test, whereas this one will return Y\test. Let's first look at the behavior without autoloading. So if we need to reference X_test and Y_test, we would need to do specific includes to include the test under X and the test under Y. The return value then, of course, is X\test and Y\test. Let's now do the same thing, but define a simple _autoload implementation. You'll notice that it takes the class name as an argument, replaces the backslash with a directory separator appropriate to this environment, adds a .php to the end, checks to see if the file exists, and then includes the file. Otherwise, it throws an exception. And as you can see, the return value for this is exactly the same as the example without using autoloading. Extending this idea a little bit, we can change the name of the function from _autoload to something else, for example, loader, and then use SPL Autoload Register. If we run this code, you'll notice that the output is exactly the same. There's no difference in functionality. But going one step further, you'll notice we can define two separate autoloaders, in this case loader and zloader, and then register both of them. The first one registered will be the preferred autoloader. If that autoloader returns false, the PHP SPL autoload mechanism will automatically move to the next autoloader, which is registered. You'll notice the primary difference now is if the autoloader is unable to load the file, instead of throwing an exception, we simply return false. To test this capability, we will first try to load a class which we know already exists under the folder X. The last line of code, however, will try to load a file test under Z, which we know does not exist. Let's go ahead and run the code. So as you can see, X_test comes back successfully. You'll notice then the first autoloader tried to load z\test, was unable to load. We then moved to the fallback autoloader, which then returned the appropriate message. An even more common implementation is to define your own class, which will end up becoming your autoloader. So notice in this example on line 10, we have our primary autoloader, which is a method called loader, our secondary autoloader, which is a method called zLoader, and then in the constructor to our autoloader class, we use SPL autoload register 2 times. To make use of our new autoloading class, we do have to include it, so there is one include command that would have to go into your code block. We would then have to create an instance of our autoloading class, and from that point on, we're able to utilize the methods within that class for autoloading purposes. So as you can see, we get the same results. X and Y load properly. Z test does not load properly because it's not found. You'll also notice that the fallback autoloader is utilized. Finally, after installing Composer, if you go into the vendor folder, you'll notice that Composer creates a file called autoload.php. This then loads the actual Composer autoloader, which has a separate class with a method called getLoader, which produces an instance of the Composer autoloader. In order to make use of this, you would have to, first of all, include the file and take the return value from the include as your autoloader instance. You could then use the method add to specify a prefix followed by a path to that particular folder structure. So in this case, X and Y are configured into the Composer autoloader with the appropriate path. We could then proceed with our code, and you will see that the functionality is exactly the same as before. So again, X test and Y test are produced. If we then try to load a class which does not exist, in this case Z test, a fatal error results with the appropriate message.